One summer a few years back, I was taking a community college class called U.S. Ethnic Literature, and we were reading a book that had Muslims in it. So I was involved in this group presentation to describe Islam at a super basic level. And I remember vividly one girl in my class asked us, "How do Muslims live without water?" Orientalism is the idea that Western representations of Muslims, Asians, Africans, and anyone else who is not from a European culture follow a kind of pattern of tropes that are dehumanizing towards the peoples being represented. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be defining Western culture and the West as people and cultures originating in Europe, and maybe more specifically in Western Europe. This includes all the cultures of the Americas that originate in Western Europe, so yes, I'm also Western since I'm culturally American. But I'm not only American, so I'm going to give some insight and analytical perspective on Dune as someone who at times identifies more with the Fremen than its main cast of off-worlders. Dune really is special and I happen to love it. It's unlike many other American science fiction in that it's based on aspects of this Arab-Muslim cultural sphere. On the other hand, Dune follows in a long tradition of Orientalist portrayals of this other world depicted by Western authors. This short essay is going to be about how Dune relates to Orientalism, how the film adaptations play into all of this, and why any of this even matters in the end. I'm going to be spoiling the new 2021 and 2024 Dune films, as well as the original novel. When I first read Dune a few years ago, it seemed obvious to me that Herbert based his Fremen culture on one of the cultures of my ancestors, which is the Amazigh in North Africa. The Amazigh are an ethno-linguistic group living all over North Africa who speak a variety of related but not always mutually understandable languages. In the West, they are also known as Berbers, but this term is considered more and more derogatory lately because of its association with the idea of barbarians. But still, Amazigh and Berber are both used, so be aware of that. I assume that Dune was about the Amazigh both because of some of the cultural elements of the Fremen, like the way they dress, as well as the fact that House Atreides uses bullfighting as a cultural symbol, and they eventually take over Dune only to be pushed back by guerrilla warfare. This whole thing reminded me of how the Spanish colonized Morocco and were met with similar tactics from the Amazigh clans in the Rif. Shout out to my great-grandparents. But of course, some things didn't line up with my interpretation. Most Amazigh people in North Africa live in isolated mountain settlements, not deserts. So I wondered if maybe Herbert was thinking more of the southern Amazigh tribes that are closer to the Sahara, or maybe groups living in and around the Sahara in general. The elements in Dune that stood out to me most were the ones that I recognized, and I didn't really realize the bigger picture until later. After reading the book, I looked online and saw that a lot of people were saying no, this was based on desert cultures in the Middle East, and I just kind of accepted that I was wrong about my assumption. But I wasn't exactly wrong, nor was I right. The confusion comes from two reasons. On one hand, Dune mixes a lot of cultural, linguistic, and religious elements from different cultures, and on the other hand, people interpreting Dune have various degrees of understanding of what they're reading. Just like to me, it seemed obvious that this was a story based on the southern Amazigh tribes of Morocco and Algeria, it seemed equally obvious to other people that this was a story based on Lawrence of Arabia, a British officer in World War I who led an army of Bedouins in the Middle East against the Ottoman government. So then I started reading about the Bedouins, who are this collection of tribes from the Arabian Peninsula, some of whom migrated west all the way to Morocco and ended up mixing with some of the Amazigh tribes there, including those in the mountains that I mentioned before, like the Zenata. It became clear that there are real groups that have specific histories and paths all across North Africa and the Middle East, but narrowing down who is an ethnic Arab, who is a Bedouin, and who is Amazigh is not so clear, as these terms are overlapping and often misapplied, especially within English and French sources. The biggest difference between these groups seems to be the linguistic and cultural ones. The term Arab also refers to speakers of Arabic across cultural and ethnic lines, but Arab is an extremely general term and it's honestly almost meaningless if you ask me. Most, if not all of these groups are Muslim of different varieties, as well as having significant minorities of Jews and Christians. So easy enough to remember everything, right? The more important point is that from a Western Orientalist perspective, it's all the same, which exacerbates the confusion. It's fascinating to watch as people online assert that the Fremen are stolen from this or that culture without realizing how general and meaningless such a blanket statement is. What the Fremen actually are is Herbert's vague interpretation of a bunch of different peoples, some Muslims and some not, who live more or less near deserts, including the Sahara, but not only. In other words, the Fremen culture is stolen from all over the world, not from one specific group, but Herbert specifically chose people that fit within an Orientalist stereotypical mold as he perceived it. Herbert's representation is a homogenized version of what Westerners imagine Muslims, Arabs, or some unspecified desert people to be. This is how he described some of his real-world cultural inspirations for the Fremen in an interview in 1969.
Or at what point did you go from the sand dunes of Oregon and the ecological background there to the decision to utilize, let's say, the Arabian mystique as another counter notion or contrapuntal notion working within the novel?
Well, of course, in studying sand dunes, you immediately get into not just the Arabian mystique, but the Navajo mystique and the mystique of the Kalahari primitives and
Kalahari primitives?
Yeah, the Kalahari Desert, the black folk of the of the Kalahari, and how they utilize every drop of water. And you can't just stop with the people who are living in this kind of environment. You have to go on to how the environment works on the people and how they work on their environment.
So clearly for Herbert, it wasn't about representing some culture in particular, but rather how various cultures, including some he considered primitive, adapt to environmental conditions. At the same time, Herbert clearly selected an Islam-based fictional religion, or at least one that uses Islamic symbols, words and phrases and rituals and cultural practices. So on one hand, Dune is about no one in particular, but on the other hand, it's clearly about a group that Herbert considers kind of in the sphere of Islam, or what he and the interviewer unfortunately call the Arabian mystique, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute. Dune brings an interesting problem to the idea of cultural representation. Herbert clearly envisioned his Fremen as a fictional group based on many different real-world cultures, and that sounds innocent on its own after all. That's pretty much how all of fiction works. I actually love science fiction interpretations of existing religions and cultures. One great example being the sequels to Ender's Game, where Orson Card depicts this futuristic, interstellar, Brazilian Catholicism. But I think for Dune, Herbert specifically chose cultures that he considered other through an Orientalist lens. And even if you aren't convinced of that, we can still show that his work is Orientalist because it's representing some sort of Arab, Amazigh, Bedouin, desert people with a religion that looks and sounds like Islam, and it's representing this group of people with all the usual tastes of Orientalism. Just listen to some of these examples of the usual Orientalist tropes being played out in Dune. The Fremen are alien to the protagonist Paul, and it's presumed that they are to the audience as well. In other words, the story is specifically created for an audience that looks like Frank Herbert, which undoubtedly colors all the representations we see. Paul learns about this alien culture and is eventually accepted by the Fremen. This isn't Orientalist in itself. After all, people obviously can and do assimilate to other cultures, or just blend many cultures within a single lifetime. But in Dune, I get the feeling that Paul does this somewhat disingenuously, which makes sense since he can see the future. In the novel, becoming part of the Fremen has more to do with Paul walking along the path he foresees to keep those around him alive, while in the films it seems to be more about acquiring military power from the Fremen.
Desert power.
Fremen culture is itself focused on an attunement to nature. Of course, environmental adaptation is a core part of any human culture, but the nativist mysticism surrounding the Fremen's relationship to their environment, juxtaposed with Paul's distance, and from the audience's perspective, a more objective view, it's problematic. Viewers in the Americas might recognize the magical native trope, and of course there's also the noble savage trope. The problem with these tropes, apart from being just inaccurate about how people relate to nature, is that they also tend to place certain cultures in a position of inferiority due to being closer to nature. By associating certain peoples with nature, imperialists can justify ruling over them, either because they are considered primitive, or because nature itself is something that Western culture seeks to dominate, but really these two things are one and the same. Associating certain groups with nature sounds nice on the surface, but in reality it tends to just take away their humanity. The Fremen are unruly religious fanatics who use guerrilla tactics against foreign invaders and are extremely effective with violence. Do I really need to explain this one?
Desert power.
And finally, the hero Paul leads the Fremen as a messiah figure, making the Fremen inevitably subordinate to the closest representation of Western culture in the book. This plays into the white savior idea, yes, but since race is not a primary cultural factor in Dune's universe, I wouldn't really want to push that narrative right now. But that's in the novel. In the film, white characters were repeatedly cast as non-Fremen, and dark-skinned people were repeatedly cast as Fremen. So the racial binary was enforced alongside the cultural one, and therefore the white savior trope was reinforced as well. All of this fits the usual Orientalist representations that Western culture continues to perpetuate. But like I said, that's not everything. I mentioned the films a little bit, but now I'm going to focus on how the film adaptations sidestep many of the central cultural tensions for the sake of this cultural sensitivity to modern Western audiences. And honestly, I'm really impressed with how the writers avoided these issues. Not that I necessarily agree with any or all of the choices. They didn't really solve the issue either, but they did manage to spin Dune in this different direction, for better or for worse, you can decide. The first thing I noticed when I watched the Dune trailer back in 2020 was the removal of the word jihad, which was replaced with crusade. In the novel, the protagonist Paul Atreides is haunted by these visions of an overwhelming interplanetary conquest carried out in his name, which is repeatedly described as a jihad. In the film, the removal of the word jihad is a no-brainer. Western audiences associate the word with terrorism rather than what the word actually means. Leaving the word in the films would probably just upset a bunch of people, conservatives for associating with Islam and liberals for cultural appropriation, and it would even offend practicing Muslims because of its fictional misuse of this religious concept. As for the Dune purists, well, I guess too bad for them because the book uses the expression holy war as well, so I guess that's all we have. Jihad is an Islamic context that relates both to the internal spiritual struggle and the external physical struggle. The spiritual struggle is considered the great jihad, while the physical struggle is the lesser jihad. And the lesser one is the one that the West tends to know and associate with terrorism, despite it being a concept that's central throughout Islam and has many analogous concepts in other religions. I'm thinking of the concept of righteousness in Christianity, for example. I feel like that's pretty similar. The film's removal of the word jihad signaled to me that this was going to be a heavily westernized interpretation of the Dune universe. One which was going to try to limit its associations with Islam or any cultures considered under the influence of Islam. I expected this to also involve a cleanse of any Arab-associated elements in the Fremen culture represented in Dune 2, but I'm happy to say this didn't exactly happen, but it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not that Dune 2 kept all the cultural elements from the novel, not at all. The filmmakers clearly intended to create something that was completely different from the many sci-fi fantasy stories of imperialist characters going native and leading their new people. I'm thinking of characters like Jake Sully in Avatar or Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones. I think that to sidestep what they saw as a problematic narrative structure, the Dune 2 creators took care to limit Paul's on-screen exposure and participation in Fremen culture. There's a scene from the book that I'm thinking of, for example, where they arrive at the siege for the first time and Paul asks Chani to hold his water counters, basically to hold his money for him. And there's this awkward moment because in Fremen culture, that is a courtship ritual. Awkward moments like these, as well as Paul's subsequent participation in the new cultural practices, are pretty much absent from the new Dune films. There are really only 2 times we can clearly see and experience real cultural expression from the Fremen. The first is through a couple of religious rituals, which did not take themselves too seriously, both because they had many detractors and because they were somewhat ridiculed and played for laughs in the theater, and including from me. I mean, I also laughed. I'm sorry, Javier, but you were really funny. The second cultural element is, of course, the extensive use of the Chicopsa language that was invented for the film using many elements from the original source material. Amazingly, the film's language creator, David Peterson, who previously worked on Game of Thrones, streamed part of his work here on YouTube. I highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in fictional languages or linguistics in general, but fictional Chicopsa is one thing, but in the books, Herbert used a lot of direct Arabic words and phrases with religious significance sometimes and historical cultural significance at other times, as well as some made-up words that he just threw in there. As fun as Peterson's job would seem, I'm sure it was difficult to juggle these choices. Using real Arabic would feel somewhat out of place in our modern cosmopolitan world, where Arabic isn't just something you can throw in your sci-fi language to spice it up. Yet at the same time, we use English to represent Paul's native language, and even modern Mandarin was used. I'll have to maybe do a whole video on how language is used in the Dune films, but for now I'll say that it seems clear that Chicopsa was intended to be very distinct from Arabic. It doesn't sound like Arabic most of the time, which the book is set 20,000 years in the future, and Arabic, along with all our modern languages, would be definitely altered beyond recognition, except by maybe expert linguists. All this is to say, the films do, to some extent, distance Fremen culture from Arabic and Islam when compared to the novel. Instead of assimilating to Fremen culture, Paul spends a good amount of on-screen time learning practical skills related to desert survival. He learns how to wear a still suit, how to walk in the desert, how to fight like the Fremen, and of course, how to ride a sandworm. Each of these acquired skills represents tangible milestones in Paul's cultural participation in the Fremen society without actually involving explicit cultural elements. So you can kind of see what they did there. They reduced being Fremen to this set of skills, rendering them culturally neutral, but preserving the essence of what Paul uses the Fremen for in the story's climax. The film also opts to focus on Paul's relationship to Chani and his own humanity in a more central and simplified way than in the novel. Aside from love stories being good for film, especially when they involve Zendaya and Timothy, the new focus allows Chani to represent another cultural milestone in Paul's integration with the Fremen. I think that Paul's deteriorating relationship with Chani at the end of the second film also represents his loss of humanity as a result of accepting to become the prophet he was foretold to be. This is another major change from the book because in the films, Paul is more grounded, humanized, and frankly normal throughout the entire story than the book Paul ever is, even at the beginning. The movie alters Paul from this aloof, superhuman, and godlike attitude in the novel to fit the central theme the filmmakers wanted to focus on, which is Paul succumbing to his own mythology and accepting his fate at the cost of his own humanity. Edward Said's book Orientalism outlines countless examples of important Orientalist portrayals in Western literature across many languages, but he also takes the time to explain why these portrayals matter and why they really are a problem. Said demonstrates how Western literature and its political repercussions position the West as separate from the rest of the world, at first creating a binary of West and East, a binary which has increasingly become the West and the rest. Basically, modern Western culture defines itself in relation to being different from this idea of Eastern culture. The West is considered Christian or secular, not Muslim or pagan like those people over there. The West is liberal and democratic, while the East is totalitarian, fundamentalist, communist, or whatever other thing the West finds bad at that moment. The West is living in the present, while the East is living in the past. And most importantly, the West is independent and active, while the East is, or maybe it should be, dependent or passive. This binary, in an attempt to justify itself, falsely essentializes East and West into rigid and absurd categories. Said points out how absurd these terms really are. East of what? West of who? Clearly, both terms require the existence of the other, in the same way Orientalism is used to define the existence of Western culture. We are who we are because we're not them. It's similar to the way white and person of color are terms that relate to each other in a false binary, each presupposing the existence of the other, but maybe that's a topic for another video. Said shows how this binary serves to dehumanize non-Western peoples in Western eyes, creating a fictional caricature of the non-West that audiences use as their primary lens for interacting with this supposed other world. So people read and watch Dune because it is a Western portrayal of Eastern cultural practices, But people don't want to simply read or watch literature or film directly. If there's one political reason to reject Orientalist narratives, it's because they justify imperialism both past and present. Think of any American wars from the last few decades. How were they justified? And think of how colonization and slavery were justified. It's always the same thing, and in the end, it's rooted in the persistent representation of the other as inferior, primitive, backward, violent, stupid, and even fundamentalist. Let's go back to my classmate who asked me why Muslims live in places without water. She must have learned that narrative somewhere, or inferred it from the symbols she encountered. When you have representations of people in books, in movies, and in news coverage that consistently paints a certain picture, in this case an Orientalist one, the result is that people think Arabs and Muslims and Middle Easterns and North Africans and whoever else are all one thing, specifically a group of violent and thirsty people camping out in the desert. At the end of Orientalism, Said writes a quote that I think will help us wrap up this video. He says, "I consider Orientalism's failure to have been a human one as much as an intellectual one. For in having to take up a position of irreducible opposition to a region of the world it considered alien to its own, Orientalism failed to identify with the human experience, failed also to see it as human experience.